We're talking about whether something is good or evil. To say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or evil independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. To say, for example, that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil, even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good, and it would still have been evil even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them, so that everyone believed the Holocaust was good. My first claim is that if there is no God, then moral values are not objective in that sense. Traditionally, objective moral values have been based in God, who is the highest good. He is the locus and paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving nature supplies the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is by nature loving, generous, just, faithful, kind, and so forth. And thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist. But if God does not exist, what basis remains for objective moral values? In particular, why think that human beings would have moral worth? On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On atheism, I can't see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than insect well-being or dog well-being or monkey well-being. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have similarly evolved behavior for the same reason. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on an atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively true. The philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory, end quote. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution back to the beginning and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were raised under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality objectively true is to succumb to the temptation of speciesism, that is to say, an unjustified bias toward one's own species. The objective worthlessness of human beings on a naturalistic worldview is underscored by two implications of that worldview: materialism and determinism. Naturalists are typically materialists or physicalists who regard man as a purely animal organism. But if there is no mind distinct from the brain, then everything we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic makeup. There is no personal agent who freely decides to do something. But without freedom, none of our choices is morally significant. They're like the jerks of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of sensory input and physical constitution. And what moral value does a puppet or its movements have? Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. If there is no God, then any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a tiny speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur. Secondly, if God does not exist, objective moral duties do not exist. Duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. Now, you might think at first that the distinction between right and wrong is the same as the distinction between good and evil. But if you think about it, you can see that this is not the case. Duty has to do with moral obligation, with what I ought or ought not to do. But obviously, you're not morally obligated to do something just because it would be good for you to do it. For example, it would be good for you to become a doctor, but you're not morally obligated to become a doctor. After all, it would also be good for you to become a firefighter or a homemaker or a diplomat, but you can't do them all. So there's a difference between moral values and moral duties. Now, my claim is that if God does not exist, then it seems we have no objective moral duties. To say that we have objective moral duties is again to say that we have certain moral obligations regardless of whether we think that we do. Traditionally, our moral duties were thought to spring from God's commandments, such as the 10 Commandments. Far from being arbitrary, these commands flow necessarily from his moral nature. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, discrimination, and oppression. But if there is no God, what basis remains for objective moral duties? On the atheistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it does not rape her, for there is no moral dimension to these actions. They are neither prohibited nor obligatory. So if God does not exist, why think that we have any moral obligations to do anything? Who or what imposes these moral duties upon us? Where did they come from? It's very hard to see why they would be anything more than a subjective impression ingrained into us by societal and parental conditioning. On the atheistic view, certain actions, such as incest or rape, may not be biologically and socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development have become taboo. They go against the social contract that Shelley has imagined. But that does absolutely nothing to show that rape and incest is really wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. On the atheistic view, the rapist who flouts the herd morality or the social contract is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably, like the man who flouts etiquette by belching loudly at the dinner table. If there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law which we must obey. It's all a matter of social convention on a par with rules of etiquette. Thirdly, if God does not exist, then there is no basis for moral accountability. Traditionally, it's been held that God holds all persons morally accountable for their actions. Despite the inequities of this life, in the end, the scales of God's justice will be balanced. And thus, the moral choices that we make in this life have an eternal significance. But if God does not exist, what basis remains for moral accountability? Even if there were objective duties and values under atheism, they seem to be irrelevant because there's no moral accountability. If life ends at the grave, then ultimately it makes no difference whether you live as a Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky rightly said, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. Given the finality of death, it really does not matter how you live. The state torturers in Soviet prisons understood this all too well. Richard Wurmbrandt reports, "The cruelty of atheism is hard to believe when man has no faith in the reward of good or the punishment of evil. There is no reason to be human. There is no restraint from the depths of evil which is in man." The communist torturers often said, "There is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish." I have heard one torturer even say, "I thank God, in whom I don't believe, that I have lived to this hour when I can express all the evil in my heart." He expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted on prisoners. Given the finality of death, it really doesn't matter how you live. So, what do you say to someone who concludes that we may as well just live as we please out of pure self-interest? You might say it's in your best self-interest to adopt a moral lifestyle. But clearly that's not always true. We all know situations where self-interest runs smack dab in the face of morality. Moreover, if you're sufficiently powerful, like a Ferdinand Marcos or a Papadoc Duvalier or even a Donald Trump, then one can pretty much ignore the dictates of conscience and safely live in self-indulgence. Historian Stuart C. Easton sums it up well when he writes, "There is no objective reason why man should be moral unless morality pays off in his social life or makes him feel good. There is no objective reason why man should do anything save for the pleasure it affords him." To believe, then, that God does not exist and that there is thus no moral accountability would be quite literally demoralizing. For then we'd have to accept that our moral choices are ultimately insignificant, since both our fate and that of the universe will be the same regardless of what we do. By demoralization, I mean a deterioration of moral motivation. It's hard to do the right thing when that means sacrificing your self-interest, or to resist temptation when desire is strong. And the belief that ultimately it doesn't matter what you choose or what you do is apt to sap one's moral strength and so undermine one's moral life. As Robert Adams observes, having to regard it as very likely that the history of the universe will not be good on the whole, no matter what one does, seems apt to induce a cynical sense of futility about the moral life, undermining one's moral resolve and one's interest in moral considerations. The absence of moral accountability from the philosophy of atheism thus makes an ethic of compassion and self-sacrifice a hollow abstraction. In sum, I think it's plausible that without God, there are no objective moral values, moral duties, or moral accountability. God is therefore vitally necessary to morality. Now, as I said, this is a conclusion which is accepted by a great many atheist philosophers, such as Nietzsche, Russell, and Sartre. Though the conclusion is a painful one, these thinkers believe that honesty compels them to face it squarely. The challenge confronting the atheist philosopher, who continues to cling to objective moral values and duties after letting go of God, is, I think, threefold. First, to explain what is the basis for objective moral values on atheism. In particular, what is the basis for the intrinsic value of human beings? Second, to explain what is the source of objective moral duties on atheism. What makes certain acts obligatory or forbidden if there is no moral lawgiver to command or prohibit them? Why is it wrong to harm other members of our species, to inflict harm upon others? Thirdly, to explain how on atheism ultimate moral accountability exists, or alternatively, to explain why it is not necessary to morality. These questions must, I think, be addressed if one is to maintain that God is not necessary to morality.
We'll now have 10 minutes of questioning between Dr. Craig asking Dr. Kagan about his thoughts.
Well, obviously, a number of questions came up in my talk that would be pertinent to what you shared, Shelly. In your opening address, you said right or wrong depends upon the whether you hurt other people without justification. And when asked, are these really wrong, you answered yes. Why? Because it harms the victim. Now, I guess my difficulty is that I certainly agree that it's wrong to harm people, obviously, but it's hard for me to understand on a naturalistic worldview, such as I described, why on the worldview of naturalism, inflicting harm upon other members of our species is really wrong. It seems to me that this happens all the time among other animals, and so why is it wrong peculiarly for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right, so let's start with that. Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong, or 3-year-old's probably old enough he has done something wrong. Like a year and a half, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference? Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't have the capacity, right? There are differences between people that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's not wrong. If you or I were to engage in that behavior, we can reflect upon that. We can recognize the reasons for not behaving that way. So I think the distinction is a fairly straightforward one, not a deep mystery or a hard challenge for the naturalist to respond to.
Okay, I think that's a good answer for why we wouldn't regard animals as moral agents who would be culpable for their acts. But it seems to me that at best that answer would go to show that rationality, or the ability to reflect rationally on things, is a necessary condition for moral behavior, but I don't see that that's a sufficient condition for moral behavior. It's still not clear to me why it would be wrong for creatures who have considerably complex neurological systems to inflict harm on each other on a naturalistic worldview in the struggle for survival.
Okay, so the question you asked initially was, how can I explain why it's wrong for me to murder when it's not wrong for lions to murder? And to answer that question, all it takes is for me to point out a relevant difference between us, and you've just, I think, said, yeah, all right, so I managed to do that. If we now shift to the question, so what does it take for wrongness to enter the world above and beyond rationality? I think the answer might well be, actually, once we achieve a certain level of rationality, nothing more is taken. Nothing more is needed. The reason it's objectively wrong for me to engage in murder is precisely because there is a reason for me not to do it, a reason that I'm capable of recognizing. And if you ask, well, what more does it take? The answer is, well, those are the basic ingredients right there. We can refine it. I mean, we can put a little icing on it if we'd like to make it. But in terms of the essentials, that's it. What there's reason for me to do depends on what kind of creature I am. Once I become the kind of creature in the evolutionary, process, once creatures evolve that are capable of stepping back from their actions, capable of reflecting about whether or not their behavior makes sense, whether it conforms to standards that they are themselves prepared to endorse, at that point the machinery is in place. And at that point there are reasons for me to behave in certain ways and to avoid other kinds of behavior. And if you ask, but what makes that wrong?
I'm still not clear as to why these beings suddenly achieve intrinsic moral worth in virtue of having these complex nervous systems that enables them to have self-reflection and so forth.
If you put it as complex nervous systems, it sounds pretty deflationary.
Right.
What's so special about having a complex nervous system? But of course, that complex nervous system allows you to do calculus. It allows you to do astrophysics. It allows you to write poetry. It allows you to fall in love. Put under that description, you ask, what's so special about humans from a naturalistic perspective? I'm at a loss to know how to answer that question. If you don't see why we'd be special and different from everything else in creation, that because we can do poetry, we can write a novel, we can think philosophical thoughts, we can do calculus, and we can think about the morality of our behavior, I don't know what kind of answer could possibly satisfy you at that point.
Well, obviously the kind of answer that I offered, but
can I ask just to follow up on that? Because I'm tempted to say I could play this game, and that's unfair, because of course it's not a game, but I could pose the same kinds of questions to you. Perhaps I will, in 10 minutes. I could say, look, all right, so God says, you guys are really, really special.
Right.
So, how does his saying it make us really special? But you see, he gave us a soul. How does our having a soul make us special? Whatever answer you give, you could always say, with regard to that, what's so special about that? At a certain point, you're just going to have to say, you know what? These features really do seem to me to be special. Insofar as it seems to me that our ability to communicate, to reflect, to love, to be creative, and consequently to shape our behavior with an eye towards how we're interacting with one another, these things strike me as remarkable ways in which we're special.
I think that they strike all of us that way, and that's the difficulty, perhaps, I think, in showing what I'm attempting to show, is that we all do, I think, intuitively value one another. We value persons. We value poetry, creativity, and all of these things. I think we all agree that these are goods. The question is, though, on a naturalistic view, why think that these things are goods? It seems to me that you emphasize in your own book, On the Limits of Morality, the importance of having explanations and not cutting off the search for explanations too soon. And I wonder if you're not cutting off the search for explanations too soon by simply saying, well, I'm just going to regard persons as intrinsically valuable, but without any kind of further grounding for that.
Well, of course, I haven't claimed there is no further grounding for that. I gave you a sketch of the contractarian thought. Your attitude was, I don't find that a very compelling story. It doesn't seem to me to be the kind of thing that constitutes an adequate grounding. Yeah. I suppose these things are in the eyes of the beholder, and everybody here is entitled to decide for themselves what kind of answers will be satisfactory or not.
Well, let me ask you a different question then.
One more.
Oh, okay. Are you a determinist?
Yes.
And yet you still think that love is significant and human choices are morally significant, even though they're determined? So
to give a piece of jargon to the audience that Bill will be familiar with, I'm a compatibilist. That is to say, I believe that one can combine determinism and free will. So absent free will, humans would lack the significance that we clearly have. But I believe that's compatible with determinism. Actually, am I a determinist? Who knows what quantum mechanics teaches us about whether or not determinism is true, but at least I believe that determinism could be true without in any way threatening my conviction that humans are special.
Did you have a follow-up on that one?
Well,
I think you did.
Only to say that it just seems to me to rob moral choices of any sort of significance if we're determined to do it by the antecedent physical causes that lead up to the point of choosing and then cause our brains to react one way rather than another. I can't see how that could have any more moral significance than a tree growing a branch at a certain point in its development.
Because you're an incompatibilist. You don't believe determinism and free will. So this is a debate for another night. I mean, it's not that I think the truth of compatibilism is at all self-evident.
Can you just explain what that term means?
Compatibilism is the view that there's no logical inconsistency between belief in determinism on the one hand, and the existence of free will on the other. They're compatible. Well,
that's a little bit misleading, though. I mean, you need to explain what you mean by free will in that case, if everything's determined.
What I was trying to do is simply give a quick definition. Remember, I said that this is a very, as you know, it's a very, very complicated question. We would basically hijack the entire rest of the evening to start trying to...
I'm unclear on the terms myself.
Right. So my thought was just that the plausibility of the compatibilist view that I hold, I don't take to be self-evident. I believe it takes philosophical argumentation for it. I completely agree that those drawn to incompatibilism, those drawn to the view that you can't have both deterministic physical laws and robust free will think if naturalism is true and the best science teaches us that determinism is true, itself a controversial question whether that's the best interpretation of our best science, then we'll lack free will. And then if free will is necessary for having special value, then we'll lack special value. But there's a lot of premises before we get to the conclusion that naturalism doesn't have space for this special value. And I reject several of those premises, which is why I'm not feeling uncomfortable by the challenge that Bill's raising.
Well, let's turn the table, and now you'll ask Bill some questions.
All right. So one of the things that you said in your opening remarks, you quoted several people. I think there was a long quote from Michael Roos saying something like, if naturalism is true, if theism is false, then ethics is illusory, deeper meaning is illusory. That's not an exact quote, but I think those phrases were there. And I found that an interesting slide, or so it seemed to me. The move from ethics is illusory to deeper meaning is illusory. I think I want to concede that in the way you mean deeper meaning, I don't believe in deeper meaning. Because I think when you talk that way, you think for there to, not that I have any trouble talking about meaning or even deep meaning, but when you talk that way, I think you're thinking it's got to be meaning on a cosmic scale. that's where some of the points about accountability come in as well.
Yes.
So, fine, I believe that humans are just creatures that evolved on this tiny little speck of dust. But I don't see how the denial of deeper meaning should give me any reason to think, therefore I'm committed to ethics as illusory. So perhaps you could explain that.
Where that came in, I think, was with respect to moral accountability.